Welcome. I'm Glen Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. The world has heaved a great sigh of relief that the arrogant, violent, and abusive Bush-Cheney regime is near its end, but U.S. foreign policy is notoriously bipartisan. While it bends a little bit this way or that way from one administration to the next, the underlying assumptions and the core policies have remained frustratingly stable for many decades. The new Obama administration has great potential to turn things around, and it will certainly reform many policies and practices. But the choice of vice president and the early appointments to the cabinet show a frightening range of consistency that's pretty narrowly hawkish and a continuation of many of the main themes from decades past, not the change that so many voters were demanding. This month we'll examine United States foreign policy of the recent past, not just the past 8 years, but a longer stretch of decades, and we'll explore new directions that Obama and the Congress could take to promote a peaceful and just foreign policy. Now's the time for every person to learn about the realities, reflect on your values, stimulate fresh thinking for peace and justice around the world, and express your ideas to the federal government, to the Obama administration, and to the new Congress. To help us do that, we have two guests who have been on this program many times in the past. I respect their great knowledge, their wisdom. They're very articulate, and they will help prod us to some new thinking on this program. I'm happy to welcome Steve Niva and Helena Meyer-Knapp. Steve Niva teaches international politics and Middle East studies at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. He's written about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for Middle East Report magazine, and his writings have appeared in many respected periodicals. He's currently writing a book on Israel's military violence and suicide bombings. Helena Meyer-Knapp taught about foreign policy for foreign affairs for many years at the Evergreen State College. She wrote the book Dangerous Peacemaking, which analyzed 7 wars in depth and identified some factors that prolonged those wars and some factors that allowed them to stop. She continues to travel and study about the world around us. I'm glad you're both here. This will be an information-packed hour, I know, just
here,
based
Glenn.
on our conversations that we've had leading up to this. So we'll pack a lot of good stuff into this hour. We'll be analyzing some foreign policy issues and recommending new directions for the Obama administration and the new Congress. And to give us some context and perspective, let's look beyond just the past 8 years to the really the 6 decades since the end of World War II. And I wonder if either or both of you could summarize just a few of the main dimensions and the main themes of U.S. foreign policy since about 1945.
Well, two main themes that stand out are one, the drive to control key strategic resources that drive the modern industrial economy since World War II, namely the control over oil in the Middle East. Since the relationship with Saudi Arabia in 1945, the U.S. has sought to make the oil regions of the world one of its main domains. And the second thing would be the drive to expand American markets, which was a huge focus of U.S. foreign policy after World War II, which of course led to numerous interventions, particularly in Central and South America, but also many other places in the world. And I think left behind a pretty poor legacy. And there was also the context of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. And I think I'd add also that we have a foreign policy that is always justified by a certain kind of moral good standing. We're there to spread democracy now. We used to be there to hold this evil force called communism in check, to prevent the world becoming atheist. There's always a very strong moral stance, and it would be a mistake to say that because Obama is trying to do things that are morally correct, he's carving a new path, because actually that's always the argument in the United States. It has been for the last over 60 years.
Yeah. Well, it sort of operates at two levels. There's this moral veneer, while underneath we're doing some other things that have to do with power and economics, but there's a moral veneer for public consumption, the
Not
PR.
Yes, it's not just public consumption, it actually mobilizes people. I mean, it's not ineffective. It's a very important motivating force. It's a very important reason that the American public gets behind foreign policy.
So in the past 8 years, when George W. Bush has been in the White House, how has that legacy changed? What's been different in the past 8 years?
Well, there's been a lot of continuity, of course, but I think particularly in those two main issues that I mentioned, control of world's energy resources and driving to expand and open markets around the world. But the last 8 years have been dominated by what we call neoconservatism, the rise of a particularly virulent strain of American unilateralism that has sought to essentially become the world's remaining superpower or unipolar dominating country. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, I think the U.S. foreign policy has been much more driven by overt acts of war, dropping a lot of the sort of the noble rhetoric of the past even to a sort of more baldly imperial project.
Well, some people have sort of gloated about, hey, we're an empire now, we should get what's coming to us, and they mean that in the positive sense,
yeah. Oddly enough,
not in the blowback sense.
Oddly enough, an English academic, Neil Ferguson, that is right in the middle of it, one of the most important advocates for the America to claim its imperial status.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think though one of the other interesting things is that the moral stance lost a lot of credibility in Iraq, in the sort of build-up to Iraq, because we went through the moral argument so quickly. First of all, it was the nuclear threat, and then it was get rid of Hitler, and then it was rebuild democracy, and we went through them so fast that people began to see them as a facade rather than as a genuine cause.
They sort of fell one by one.
One by one,
and
yes.
then we end up in this quagmire. Part of what, based on what you're saying, there's some motivation, some rationale behind our foreign policy, but there's also been a lot of sloppy thinking. And it seems to me like whenever I see sloppy thinking going on anywhere, you end up with sloppy decisions and sloppy outcomes. What have you seen? How have you seen that come out in the foreign policy arena?
Well, one of the most obvious ones had to do with the failure to imagine what was going to happen immediately after the invasion of Iraq. That there was this sort of simple-minded image, I'd say simple-minded more than sloppy, image of victory, cheerleaders dancing in the streets, and laurel wreaths for everybody on one side, and then a lot of people actually in the State Department saying it's not going to be like that. You don't understand. It's much more complicated. And I would say that the general theme in the last 8 years has been that the person who wants to advocate for a complicated analysis is dismissed in favor of the person who's willing to make a simple-minded, straightforward statement.
Something kind of a bumper sticker logic
Yes.
and short attention span.
Soundbite
Yes.
foreign policy.
Yeah, sort of a schoolyard bully soundbite foreign policy. I mean, one of the absolute, not just sloppy, but stupid ideas that the Bush administration entertained was that a massive show of force in the Middle East, somewhere, of course it happened to be in Iraq, would somehow lead to sort of a domino theory effect around the region that would break open old regimes, that would send a message to the Arab street that the United States was this great power that couldn't be responded to or fought back against. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's been exactly the opposite. It's simply emboldened and enraged more and more people. And of course, the U.S. undermined itself in Iraq right away through this theory of sort of shock and awe. Mm-hmm. We'll come in hard and fast. And if you want to write the book on how to create an insurgency against you, not only in Iraq, but around the region, around the Muslim world, and even more, and even further than that, that's exactly what you do.
Mm-hmm. I think also, you mentioned this is not just Obama, but it's Obama and the Congress.
Yeah.
And I would say one of the striking features of the last 8 years has been the ways in which Congress, at least at the beginning, was completely unwilling to discuss, engage, analyze, think. When Barbara Lee voted against the money, originally she was dismissed as unpatriotic when in fact she was the only person who was actually thinking. Congress has been really delinquent in its obligation to analyze and if there's anything
accountable.
If there's anything to be learned from the Vietnam era, it's that after the war in Vietnam was coming to an end, Congress finally picked up the ball and started doing some serious realigning and passing important legislation about covert action control and so on. And we needed Congress a long time ago, and we didn't have it.
Right. Are there other misguided policies that come to mind that have come out of these past 8 years or so?
Well, something away from simply the war and peace aspects of U.S. foreign policy would be the complete rejection of global efforts to address the issue of climate change and global warming, and the absolute ignorance shown in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence that not only is this happening, but it's happening at rates that we didn't even imagine 5 years ago. The Bush administration has simply ignored or undercut these global efforts, the Kyoto Treaty, and many other promising efforts, which the Obama administration is going to have to address right away. And there are some signs to its credit that it will address many of these.
Yeah. For one of the dominant aspects of the foreign policy for quite a while has been the Cold War. And for half a century, that was the frame, that was the filter for understanding anything that went on in the world. It was framed in terms of us versus them in the Cold War. And now we have a different, after the Soviet Union has crumbled, we have a different frame and things get filtered through a so-called war on terror. Is that whole notion of a war on terror a useful concept, or is that more...
It belongs to the dustbin of history, as they might say. This is probably the single worst idea of the Bush administration, that after 9/11 we need to engage in something called a war on terror, both in the sense that we needed a war, in other words, a military-led, a violence-led solution to the problem of violence against us, and secondly, that there's a notion of terror out there. Terror is a tactic of a whole variety of groups, and instead the Bush administration lumped all groups which were engaged in some sort of armed resistance against their own people or against the United States into one single glob, in a sense, and created this sort of us and them view of the world. And not only has this proven to be counterproductive, but it would never work to actually stop the actual origins of the conflicts that drive political violence in the world.
And in fact, one of the things I discovered as I was doing the research for my book was to realize that in order to bring a conflict to an end, it was always essential for the sort of dominant violent group to stop calling its enemy terrorists. The British had to stop calling the Irish terrorists. The South Africans had to stop calling the ANC terrorists. While we use the phrase terror, we are in effect guaranteeing for ourselves that we will continue to use a militarized solution. It builds in a particular tactic, which is, I think, a terrible mistake.
And there's no end game built into it unless you kill everybody. I mean, because like you say, if terror is a tactic, if that's a method, then anybody who seems inclined to act out in that way is somebody that needs to be killed, and we'd end up having to kill, hundreds of millions of people around the world. Where does it end? How do you win?
Well,
There's no end game.
There's no end game, but there's no end game for any war. Every war starts with a fantasy about an end game which isn't real. The end that finally comes from a completely different place than the beginning. And so I think the danger in the term is much more that it precludes even thinking about an end. Not that there isn't an end game, but that the word itself stops you allowing yourself to think about it. Because, of course, we will never negotiate with terrorists.
Right.
That's
everybody's myth.
Everybody's myth, but you can't do it. You have to negotiate.
And that points to the central issue, which is that these conflicts, and particularly conflicts that involve terrorism, are at root political conflicts. And in that sense, the only form of a solution that one can have is a political solution, and that means
address the root causes.
That means dealing with the root causes. And in the case of, let's say, terrorism emanating from the Middle East, the root causes are multiple, and they depend on the context. The Israeli-Palestinian context is one. The issue of the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon that's only recently ended is another, dealing with Hezbollah. The issue of undemocratic regimes in the Middle East, which are using torture and terror against their own people that generate the terrorists we see, including those involved in 9/11, or the U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the root cause of violence in the Middle East today is actually foreign occupation, and secondly, repressive regimes backed by the United States.
So the war on terror is something that just chases its own tail.
Absolutely.
It does. But I actually think that I've not heard that phrase come out of Obama's mouth. I don't think he's using it right now.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think he's using much more focused, territorially defined statements. Insofar as he's particularly concerned about terrorists at all, Osama bin Laden is the person he's concerned about, and he talks about capturing Osama bin Laden. He doesn't talk about war on terror. So, yeah. I mean, while I'm not naive enough to imagine that the Obama regime is some kind of nirvana coming our way, I would say that at the moment, there's a possibility that language is on the way out.
And I think we saw this turn in the last year of the Bush administration. You had people in the State Department saying it's time to drop this language of war on terror and so on.
Yeah, so we should let them drop it. We shouldn't help them. I'm serious.
Exactly.
I think we shouldn't give them any more time than they need.
So lay out some new approaches. What for the things that we've been discussing thus far in the program? What fresh directions would you like to see the U.S. take?
Well, I actually. Something came to me as you were introducing the show, which I think is quite interesting. And that is that some of the most important directions are actually going to come from the parts of the administration that are not explicitly involved in foreign policy. For example, the Justice Department is going to be the place which really guides us or doesn't guide us on whether or not people feel entitled to use torture and other horrifying interrogation tactics. And I would say the signs are, from the Obama appointment so far, that we're going to hold a pretty tight line on that one, that we're not going to go down the pathway that Bush opened up so publicly, at least. And similarly, in another completely different direction, I think the Homeland Security Department is changing from being a control the civil liberties department to a department run by a woman whose primary issue was immigration, which is another very important foreign policy concern. And it changes the dimensions of the structure of foreign policy to have someone who's not so security driven and is got a completely different focus on what the department is for. So it may be that the peripheral departments actually play a role in how we change.
Well, and then energy, you mentioned energy earlier on. If we can have reasonable energy policies for conservation and alternatives and not be so fixated on getting other people's oil. And we'll talk about that later on.
To say the least, but I mean, to put it in very big and bold terms, I would say that a lot of what the Obama administration is going to have to be doing is undoing the damage of the last 8 years. And that means, as Helena's pointing out, I think, undoing the torture regime, undoing the National Homeland Security State, undoing this bid for empire that it's been engaged in, undoing the damage it's done to global efforts to to deal with the issue of global climate change, undoing the fact that the United States image around the world is at its lowest ebb in the modern period. So the Obama administration, on the one hand, is going to have its hands full simply standing forward before it can offer some of its own ideas. And I think there are going to be plenty we'll talk about in the show, but I think it's going to have its hands full simply with that.
Let's take another dimension of this. In the 1940s, the United States was one of the world's leaders in creating the United Nations, in promoting international law, international standards for human rights, cooperation among nations, all kinds of good things that we were doing in the late 40s and into the 50s. In recent years, we've drifted away from that, and in the last 8 years, we've rushed away from a multilateral, world community kind of an approach. What are some things, maybe building on some of the points you made, but maybe some other points, what are some things that you'd like to see the Obama administration and the new Congress be doing to address the multilateralism as opposed to unilateralism?
Well, I would start by saying, though I have a lot of respect, as you do, for those institutions of the 1940s, I'm tremendously aware of how driven they were and guided they were by Western European, North Atlantic views of what the world was like. And I think that the economic chaos that we're involved in worldwide provides an opportunity for a kind of multilateralism that is much more open to the voices from a variety of parts of the world.
Well, and at that time, it was the northern half of the world that was the constituted the players of the game. The southern half of the world was largely colonies and under the thumb.
Indeed.
In a lot of ways. So now we have a lot more nations than there were in 1945.
Indeed. I'm not sure that the northern end has gone away yet, because I actually think that the key new players in the conversation are still northern nations, in the sense that I would call India a northern nation. It might not see itself that way, but it certainly is attached to Eurasia. China is a northern nation. The old, deeply colonized countries of Africa are still much more on the periphery of the conversation than they should be. But I do think that, oddly enough, one of the opportunities from this economic crisis time, which calls for the same kind of global financial, global economic analysis that came up after World War II, that this time it won't be just the northern countries talking.
And I think Helena's right. I think what we need to do, not only engage in multilateralism, which is sort of a simplistic first step to take, but yes, to go beyond what the United States used to engage in, which was imperial multilateralism, and rethink these institutions. For example, I think where one should start is to rethink the Security Council.
Yes.
It should no longer have permanent members like the United States, Russia, etc., and it should be expanded to include countries from different parts of the world right away. That should be done. The other UN bodies, I think, need to be more empowered, particularly those that are representing different parts of the world on different key issues. Also, there has to be a brand new way of thinking about the global economic infrastructure and institutional arrangements that we have. And I don't think the Obama administration is going to touch these issues to begin with, and certainly I don't think it's in their repertoire. But if we're thinking big, one is going to have to rethink the IMF and the World Bank and
International Monetary Fund, the IMF,
and the WTO, which really has never recovered from the 1999 Seattle protests, which were part of a broader movement. And right now it's laying fallow, and I hope it stays that way. We need new institutions that deal with all of those issues as well.
Though I think it's revealing. There are times when my analysis tracks individuals too much, I think. But I think it's revealing that Susan Rice, who was Obama's closest foreign policy advisor, is at the UN. I think that's quite intriguing.
It's an absolute priority for him, I think.
That he's put his most long-standing, serious foreign policy advisor up there.
Who many of us thought would be his Secretary of State. As a logical choice.
But I think it's a sign of his natural instinct for multilateralism.
One of the things that we talked about a few minutes ago was the in the so-called War on Terror, where the United States uses that to go after whoever it was that did 9/11, or whoever it was that does this or that, whatever act. And one of the institutions that's a multilateral, has potential, the International Criminal Court, is something that allows the world to go after people as a criminal justice issue, which if we had done this after 9/11, said, oh, this horrible crime was committed, we need to go after that, the world would have been with us instead of doing this militaristic war on terror, which turned the world against us. And I know that we have differences among ourselves in playing out this, but I just want to lift that out and see if we can talk about that for a moment. The potential for holding war criminals accountable through a lawful process like what we did after World War II, where some of the Nazi war criminals were held accountable. Well, talk about that.
Well, I think something that's really crucial here is going to be the issue of international law, because the Bush administration essentially said it doesn't exist, it doesn't matter, we won't follow it.
And U.S. exceptionalism.
U.S. exceptionalism, uber alles. And there's no question that the Obama administration coming in is going to be emphasizing this with a particular interest on the issue of genocide. That many of the former Clinton administration officials who Obama was bringing in were deeply scarred by both the Bosnia genocide and the Rwandan genocide, particularly the Rwandan genocide, where the Clinton administration, and I think one of its worst acts of lack of courage and principle, allowed to happen, more or less. And so that's going to be a big issue there. But my sense is this needs to be expanded. I think it's absolutely crucial that that war criminals be held accountable, that the reign of impunity that many of those who commit these war crimes and crimes against humanity, act under, that they need to be brought in. However, the concern is that the institutions that exist will be selective and will reflect the great powers that exist at the moment. And so somehow these two issues need to be squared, that there needs to be a broadly multilateral and fair and just sort of way of doing this, but at the same time I think it's imperative that there are certain standards set that through which people are held accountable.
Helena, what's your take?
Well, as you know from prior conversations, I'm not such a fan of the International Criminal Court. I could go on at length about it. I won't, but I will say that I think one of its fundamental flaws is precisely that it was created as justice of the strong. It was created by the Europeans in part to hold Americans accountable, in part to tell the Americans, you don't like this, but we think this is the moral and just thing to do. It hasn't worked because the Americans simply didn't sign on to it. But I think
the U.S. government didn't.
Well, that's right. The U.S. government
and maybe American public opinion. I don't know
American
about
public
that.
opinion is not particularly wild about foreigners telling Americans what to do. This isn't our national strength, and I do think that the prosecutions, for example, that have resulted from the Rwandan and Bosnian genocide are make the Bush administration look efficient. They have been so expensive, they've been so long drawn out, and they've dealt with so few cases that I think that just the ordinary practicalities of the current system are very poor.
So then where does accountability come from?
Well, accountability is a complicated part of war and peacemaking, and I think my primary concern is that one shouldn't rush for it. That people like Pinochet turn out to be held accountable, but only after a while. And accountability in the criminal justice model tends to be no delays. So this is a long topic. I'm not sure it's where the Obama administration is going to go.
No,
I just happen to think that it's not necessarily the central institution of the international institutions available to us right now.
That would be something for knowledgeable people to come up with some good solution to. If there's a need for this and the current institution isn't working right.
I would just add, though, that I think in some ways people don't need to let these international institutions or the government speak for themselves on these matters of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And my actual preference is the growing use of universal jurisdiction, of people actually taking war criminals to court in Spain or in England or
I love
elsewhere
that.
at this level.
Right.
And so we know, for example, now Henry Kissinger does not want to go to Paris. He's worried. Dick Cheney should not want to go anywhere outside the United States. He should be worried because he should be held accountable.
will-
and this happened to
Yes.
Pinochet as well.
Yeah.
So
I'm much more enthusiastic about that.
yeah.
Yeah,
Really, seriously.
Nations will arrest them as
Yeah.
war criminals, and then we'll see how
It's
that
a much
goes.
it's a much better it's a much more satisfactory process, I think.
When we were preparing for the program, Helena, you mentioned a book by Helena Coban titled Re-Engage, America and the World After Bush. Can you tell us what you found in that book?
Well, what I like about it is that it's very short, and it's written for ordinary people, and it's a manual, if you will, of different types of ways to think about a new America in the world, a new United States. She's particularly interested, for example, in the United States pursuing non-militaristic policies. She's particularly interested in the United States pursuing global climate change policy in collaboration with other nations rather than unilaterally. But the useful thing I would say for the audience, for me also, but is that it was written with very specific suggestions about policies to advocate for, and it's short. Helena Coban also has a very nice website and blog called Just World News and .org, I think, .org? Mm-hmm. I think so. And she's a very smart activist thinker who tracks day-to-day foreign policy issues. And if you've had it with the New York Times and you've had it with The Nation, try Helena Coban. I think she's really smart.
And her name is Cobban.
That's right.
Is the spelling, and she works with the American Friends Service Committee, some Quaker-based group.
Yes, she's the American Friends Service Committee has a group of activist friends who live and work in Washington, D.C., and they are, one of their functions is to stay in close contact with the American government in Washington when issues arise, to go lobby and talk. And her particular concern is the Middle East. She's been writing for many, many years about the Middle East.
I want to pick up on the war on terror issue and look at some of the results. We talked about that earlier from a couple angles. I'd like to hear some more from you about the torture, Guantanamo and stuff. When we were preparing for the telephone program, Helena, we were on the phone, and you said much of the credibility that the U.S. lost in Western nations we have credited for by electing Obama, but that credit will evaporate quickly unless we turn the credit into reality.
Yes.
So you want him to walk the talk.
I want him to walk the talk, and I think...
Well, not just you, but you're saying Western nations.
I think this is a very narrow focus. My eye was distinctly on Europe, Canada, Australia. I wouldn't call Japan a Western nation, but in that industrialized modern part of the world, Guantanamo is a very big issue. I think there are many more issues. I'm not sure it's the only issue in lots of the parts of the world. But in those Western nations, it's really very important. And it's not going to be easy to close the place, partly because we are going to be so dreadfully embarrassed as we hear case after case after case of
things will be coming to light that
yes.
we've been able to keep the lid on.
And the reality is that there are a couple of hundred people there who themselves do not want to go back necessarily to their countries of origin. They aren't safe if they go back to their countries of origin.
But fortunately, a lot of European countries are stepping up now and saying that they're going to take these.
They're going to think
Germany,
about
Belgium,
taking them.
Some other countries talked about this. My sense is if there's a will and pressure, it will happen.
It's certainly
but-
potential.
Yeah, but I think that is absolutely symbolic and absolutely crucial. But Guantanamo is illustrative of the broader problem, which is a space where laws do not apply,
Right.
where international law does not apply, and where things can be done that violate all sense of humanity. And in that sense, it seems to me that as part of undoing empire, which Obama's going to have to engage in to some extent, and we're going to have to push him and hold him accountable to do more of,
Right.
he's got to shut down all of these black sites
That's
that the
right.
CIA was using around the planet.
That's the concern I have, is that
Yeah.
if Guantanamo is so well known, and people say, "Oh yeah, close that down," and
Yeah.
I'd be concerned that okay, they shut that down,
And it has
then
to,
move these
but-
people to some other secret
Yeah.
location,
Yeah.
beat the crap out of them, and
Yeah.
then we don't
And-
notice
That's
But
right.
that's a symbol. We got to do that whole network of all
No,
those.
they won't move those people. Those people are named, identified, and they have public defenders. They won't get moved.
Yeah.
It's the new people.
but
And I think to carry on from what Steve was saying, in many ways Guantanamo is symbolic of the national security state,
Yeah.
which is one part of the U.S. governmental system. We have an enormous covert government operation and have had since the Cold War. I mean, it's 60 years old. It's very, very well established. It's extremely powerful. It's going to resist in any way it can losing power. I think the appointment of Leon Panetta is quite interesting in that
I actually
regard.
think it's quite positive in that
It's
regard.
a very positive
It's a
step.
surprise,
Because it seems to me the broader term, and if we're going to mention books, we have to mention Jane Mayer's book, The Dark
Yes,
Side, which is about
absolutely.
the torture regime, which everyone should read. But that will require closing down the black sites, closing down the extraordinary rendition operations that have been in play, and then two very practical things are. It means embracing the newly revised Army field manual,
Yes.
which says torture is unacceptable, and particularly because it will blow back on the U.S. And it means holding the CIA accountable. And this is why I brought it up, which is the CIA had excluded itself from even the norms of the U.S. Army, and it can no longer. And that's why I find it hopeful that Panetta is now in charge.
But I think this is, once again, an area where I just hope Congress will also step in.
Yeah.
Well-
because it was Congress, it was the Frank Church holding hearings in the immediate aftermath of Vietnam.
Senator from Idaho, of all places, in the late 70s, after all this stuff was coming out, and this was big news at that time, in the late 70s.
And that was when we passed the controls that are now on the CIA
Yeah.
that have been undermined so badly. But I think it's a really tricky part of American foreign policy. I'd like to be hopeful, but I'm not as hopeful about the covert part of American foreign policy as I would like to be.
Right. But the Congress will not step up to the responsibility unless they're pressured to do that. They just don't like controversy.
Well,
And they will not do it unless the American people force them to with as much pressure as we can
I
muster.
absolutely agree that
crucial.
everyone should be out there, because it's going to be forcing them to step up and forcing them to hold the past actions accountable that will further institutionalize, perhaps leading to something like the Church Commission. However,
And including some of the complicity of their own leadership.
well,
who
that's
have
what I
been
was just going
briefed
to say.
on.
However,
Oh,
the problem is that
yeah.
many of them were actually at those meetings where these
They're complicit.
these interrogation techniques were discussed
They
and
were
brought, and so they don't want that to be shown. And then more generally, the truth of the United States government is we have a national security state in which Democrats and Republicans are simply kinder or less kinder versions of the same system, and there's a certain institutional inertia behind that.
I want to move us through some geographical areas, and we've allocated just like a minute or so for each of these, and even though they're huge topics and they each deserve their own program, and these have actually had their own programs on our show for a full hour, but what would you like Obama and Congress to do about Iraq?
Well, fortunately, we have an agreement on paper right now, the
Status of
SOFA, the Status of Forces Agreement that was recently signed, which more or less on paper constitutes a major defeat for the Bush administration in nearly every one of its goals. For example, the notion that U.S. contractors should not be held accountable to Iraqi law, no longer on paper. The notion that American soldiers can have free reign throughout the streets and cities of Iraq, no longer on paper. The notion that American bases, these huge sprawling bases around Iraq that have been built up so immensely over the past few years, that they can continue to exist right there near Iraq's oil fields, conveniently placed. According to the agreement, no longer. The agreement says by June, combat forces should be out of Iraqi cities, and within 2 years, the U.S. Military should be out of Iraq. I'm very concerned that Obama will either be pressured by those within the national security state or others to engage in what I'd call imperial temptation, to not go all the way on that. And that's where I believe we're going to have to step up, the American public's going to have to step up to strictly monitor this agreement. It's not as good an agreement as I wished we would have had. I would have had much stricter timelines. I would have had much more firm, ironclad guarantees on no U.S. troops remaining in shorter periods of time. However, that's going to be the challenge.
Can we get less than 1 minute on Afghanistan?
Sure.
The next quagmire.
Sure. So Afghanistan has defeated everybody, and we would be extremely foolish to imagine that we would be any different.
Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting things about Afghanistan is it's perfectly clear that the Taliban represents a substantial population in Afghanistan, and we have in the past vilified and demonized them. My experience about peacemaking says if you're going to make peace, you've got to talk to the people you don't like. Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting to see if we find a way to learn to talk to them, and mm-hmm. not just simply to vilify them.
Yeah, and there is a strong movement right now towards more serious negotiations with the Taliban. The Saudis have been behind it. Mm-hmm. Pakistan has been behind it. Others have been engaged. I think the U.S. has been engaged to some extent, but won't talk about it because it's sort of bad for propaganda purposes to admit that actually we are starting to go down that path. I agree with Helena. We need to continue much further down that path and then have a regional solution.
I remember your book, Dangerous Peacemaking, says that often these conversations with the people that we aren't supposed to be talking to actually were taking place, but they were done outside of the public spotlight, and that's necessary so that the important thing is to keep talking.
That's right. The important thing is to craft the new picture without everybody shooting it down before it's ready.
Yeah, yeah. Israel and Palestine. I know as we're taping this
Steve's
program,
area.
this is it's just this horrible thing underway in Gaza. And as this program is aired throughout the remainder of January, things may be changing. But can we get like a minute or so about just
right now
recommendations for foreign policy?
With its war on Gaza at the end of December. In early January of 2009, Israel struck a huge blow against the Obama administration. Much of the political goodwill that the United States had accrued because it elected actually an African American, a man with some Muslim heritage, a man who's spoken openly about ending the torture regime, about rethinking peace in the Middle East, now is being saddled with the real savagery of the Israeli attacks on Gaza. Which I think is going to make it very difficult for Obama to live up to what he's been saying, which is that he said he will make this one of the central priorities. He understands that that while the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is certainly not the only issue in the Middle East, it's one that's tied to every other conflict. So on the one hand, I have some doubts about his team that he's organized around him, folks who have long been associated with supporting right-wing Israeli policies like Hillary Clinton and Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk and others. On the other hand, right now is a historic opportunity. We're at the sunset of the two-state solution. In other words, the idea of a Palestinian state and an Israeli state living side by side. This is really the last chance for that to happen. Because after this, probably the next 2 years, Israeli settlements that have stolen Palestinian land, that have put Israeli settlers onto this land, and the walls that they've been building around small Palestinian communities will be so entrenched that all there will really be left is a one state, which will neither be completely Jewish nor democratic. It'll be an apartheid system, and in fact it already is in many respects an apartheid system. So Obama's going to have to refrain from piecemeal diplomacy, confidence-building measures, and go straight for the root of it, which is putting pressure on Israel to move those settlements, to move its soldiers, to tear down its walls, to tear down these ghettos it's been constructing. And I'm not sure he has it in him. He knows the issue. We know he knows the issue. But it's going to be a very difficult path to hoe.
But you would think that we would have leverage because the United States provides billions of dollars of military aid that has been allowing Israel to do this for years and years. And
you would think we have leverage, but Israel is a domestic political agenda as much as it's an international political agenda, and Obama wants to be reelected,
and
so in that sense,
has no political will.
Congress has no political will. Although there are honorable exceptions, and in fact, I think this recent war in Gaza actually has provoked. Well, some of the usual folks have simply stood up and said whatever Israel does is right, even if it kills 700 Palestinians and only 7 Israelis are dead. Yet that window is very small. And for those who actually understand the issue, they know that in the next 2 years, your only chance is to make something happen now. And these are going to be coming into conflict with one another.
Okay. we've got a few minutes left and a lot of stuff to cover, and we knew this was going to be happening. I want to move through a number of issues, and again, looking at other dimensions of our foreign policy and recommendations. Our foreign policy is tangled up with international economics, and people talk about the global economy or globalization. Globalization can mean different things, and can you help us understand some of the good or bad aspects of globalization, and specifically what you would like the United States to do with our foreign policy insofar as its economic policy as well?
Well, I think one of the things to understand about globalization, which we're seeing very clearly at the moment with the economy, though we also, I think, have seen it very well with global climate change, is that once a phenomenon becomes global, the control of it is very, very difficult to engineer. If a currency is isolated inside its own country, and trade is pretty isolated as well with just a few trading partners, if the currency gets weaker, then the bank can do something about it and can strengthen it again. Now everybody's currency is engaged with everybody else's currencies. They trade incredibly fast, and when someone sends a bad vibe, as it were, across the global economy, it shatters everybody. Likewise, perhaps when somebody sends a good vibe, it will strengthen everybody. The trouble is, it's very much harder to know how to set the vibe in motion. And it's much more chaotic in the chaos theory kind of sense. So what does that mean for the Obama administration? It means we can't count on any particular wonderful step to change the world for the better. And it may be that it's not our economy that actually mobilizes our own improvement. It could be, for example, that the Chinese become a genuine market in their own right, that they are now rich enough to start buying our goods, or our advice, or our support, or something. And that we stop being the consumers and start being the producers again. There are some very important parts of the globalization system that we need to allow other people to shape.
You've called for a global New Deal.
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree with Helena that we're all interconnected, especially when it comes to economics these days. And in that sense, I think Obama administration will have no chance to have an economic recovery at home if there's not to some extent an economic recovery abroad.
Right.
In other words, they are absolutely codependent. And so developing, raising wages so that people have money to buy the goods they need, or forgiving debts so that, or mortgages or other things so that people can have some sustenance and be able to purchase what they need. That same principle needs to be applied globally. I mean, my notion is that what we need is to focus on raising wages and the abilities of people in the South, in particular in poor areas of the world, and improving infrastructure there, so that we have a focus more on equality and on leveling the playing field. That is going to go a long way to improving the whole global economic output if more people actually enter into the system. And so key here is, just like at home, how we need to forgive debts, we need to deal with rapacious lending, we need to raise wages at the expense of corporate profits. The same thing has to go abroad. We need to especially forgive the debts of the at least 40 to 50 of the world's poorest countries. They should just be taken off the books at this time.
Yeah.
And that means, to some extent, retiring the IMF and rethinking the World Bank to being more of a stimulus provider rather than simply a lender.
And it takes us into fair trade, not this free
Absolutely.
trade, which has been the race to the bottom of
Absolutely.
ever lowering prices. Let's see. One of the things that's a foreign policy that you had talked about when we were preparing for the show was the immigration thing, where capital, businesses and industrial output can flow across borders, but the workers can't. And for immigrants, tell us something about how you see immigration in this, and specifically what you'd like to see, because we're quite short on time. We have just a smidge.
The United States has periods when it's incredibly hostile to its immigrant populations, and other periods when it's much more open and much more hospitable. We've been on the borderline between remaining relatively speaking hospitable and becoming horrendously closed. It's really important that we don't become closed. And it's really important that we allow wealth and people to move backwards and forwards at roughly comparable rates. Ironically, of course, at the moment, with work being so scarce in this country, a lot of the undocumented workers are leaving anyway because there's no work for them here. But the most important thing I would say that I'm sad about Bush having dropped the ball on is providing some credibility from the right about immigration and immigration policy. Because as it was with Nixon and China, there are times when we need the right wing to open up a progressive space for us. And they were almost there, and then they gave up.
McCain as well.
McCain
was there, and then he gave up in the elections.
It's very, very sad that they did that. This is, I think, territory Obama could quickly reclaim. He's got the personal and social and other credibility to do it. And I know that what economic well-being there was that spread in the 19th century had a lot to do with the spread of the migration of population. And the population needs to be free to migrate again.
Needs to be free to migrate, and then it goes back to the issue of a New Deal in the global economy, that one of the most important things is for there to be opportunities for development in other parts of the world. That's
Absolutely.
the main causes so that they
out.
come. And then just at a symbolic level, if we're going to shut down Guantanamo, we need to tear down this hideous wall they're building on the border, which is a symbol. If you ask me for bad ideas, and this has got to rank right up there as another one of the stupidest things that's happened in the last decade here.
Yeah, we've got a whole lot of things that could be done about nuclear weapons, which people haven't been paying as much attention to in the last few years as we were before. But there's a lot of stuff that needs to get done on nuclear weapons, and organizations working on it. And we should do another program on that sometime. Foreign policy doesn't happen by chance. We have just a couple minutes left. I just want to lift up the notion that powerful forces, as you've been saying, are pushing foreign policy this way or that way. And it seems as though, based on what you've said, that if we want to push our foreign policy in a smarter and more humane direction, we have to have people power voices to push back against the national security state and the entrenched economic interests, the military-industrial complex that profits by it, and so forth. So I just want to lift that up. Part of my vision for a foreign policy would be one that's not rooted in violence and just this power and greed kind of thing, with the military violence as the enforcer. Just before we close, I want to find out, what would you like the peace movement or other grassroots people to do, very briefly, and then we'll wrap up with some closing comments.
Well, I think the peace movement could do some important work if it began to focus on rethinking the definition of wealth, to come up with some new consciousness about what it takes to be living in a wise and humane world where people are actually prosperous enough. Because sometimes it feels as though we attack the oil companies, for example, for their profits, suggesting that we buy into the oil companies' definition of what a good life is. We want them to have less, we want to have more ourselves. I would like the peace movement to be thinking less in these corporatized terms and more in some fairly radical terms about what the nature of wealth is.
Creating new visions of what wealth is.
Yes, and in fact, giving more respect to definitions of wealth that exist in indigenous communities, in other parts of the world that are not riddled with capitalism from top to toe, so that an image of the world that was less prone to conflict could come out. Because this grabbing for wealth causes a lot of the fighting.
In Bhutan, this little isolated kingdom in the Himalayas, the government has for some years been tracking gross national happiness. And what a concept for us.
Right. And Norway is always at the top of the list as being one of the most humane places in the world. Well, I think one of the key things that the peace movement has to do is connect up with the economic justice movement. And it has to, I think it's going to have to link the fate of war and peace more closely to the issue of global economic inequality, and particularly challenging the corporate-driven paradigm of capitalist globalization. That's going to have to be central, I think. In other words, in 1999, we had a global justice movement that was around, ending exploitation and abuses and creating a more humane, just, and sustainable economy. And then the Bush administration came in with its wars and knocked us off our path of creating a global justice movement and made us simply focus on the anti-war dimension. That was central, but I think it's going to have to come back to that broad movement that was emerging after '99 and was a global movement and was not only thinking about peace, but was rethinking how we actually create societies together, the experiments of living together that go beyond socialism, capitalism, and other terms, and create new experiments. And I would just say one place where some of these experiments are happening now is Latin America.
Mm-hmm. Can we get like a one-sentence closing thought?
I would say my one-sentence closing thought is that I'm very interested these days in the variety of things that old-fashioned entity, the Rotary Club, does, because they have an extraordinary ethical code. They do wonderful citizen diplomacy. They work actively for peace, and they are a truly global organization.
Okay, one sentence, Steve.
Last thought is I think we should not get caught up into being consumed with the issue of Obama the person, and really look at the world and at the U.S. government and at these broader issues in more structural terms.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank both Steve Niva and Helena Meyer-Knapp. I want to thank the folks who've been watching. For information about a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence, you can contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 491-9093 or www.olyfor.org. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to do our part. And the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks.